Hello, teacher leaders. In preparation for our meeting on September 14th, I wanted to share something with you so that you had some time to process prior to our meeting. So this is, again, just for your knowledge. If you'd like to look through it beforehand, don't feel like you have to. So some of you have seen this PD plan last year. I just wanted to revisit kind of the spirit of our PD time, since our teacher leader time will be directly related to supporting you in this work. So I just wanted to revisit Wednesday mornings. So a part of our Wednesday morning time is this collaborative time. You are welcome to bring any questions you have about that to our September 14th teacher leader meeting. Most of our work will be focused on the content time, but I do want to reiterate the collaborative time is meant to be time you have with peers to talk about instructional strategies that you would like to research. It's kind of your own inquiry process, and a part of that would be the district supporting you all in observing each other teach, whether that's through video or getting subs and watching live. That's for your principal and your team to decide. Whole group time, your principal should be structuring that with you based on building needs. And then this content time, this is the part that I'd like to focus on with you a little bit before we meet next week. The content time, the spirit of that is to really focus on curriculum and assessment. So whereas the collaborative time is the how we teach, the content time is the what are we teaching, and how do we know if students know those things. So the content time, as we'll look down below in our calendar, is coded in blue. District-wide, we have this calendar. I know principals may have made some small adjustments early on, but the content time should be scheduled the same throughout the year. Now, during that content time, as a secondary team, sorry about that. Okay, during our time together as a content team, I want to support you as a department chair in how you are going through kind of a curriculum process with your departments. You'll get a copy of this. We will walk through it much more in depth on the 14th, so don't feel like you need to have this all memorized and be comfortable with it on that day, but I wanted you to have time to look at it and think about it prior to our meeting. So this process really is a curriculum, a way for you and your department to dig into the curriculum. What is it that we're teaching? So step one is really looking at our standards and determining what are our highest priority standards. What are the things that kids really need to master for us to be comfortable? And then step two would be, how do we know if they know those things? A part of knowing if they know those things is agreeing on what proficiency looks like. And some of you may have developed proficiency scales before, and some of you may not have, and we can spend some time on the 14th talking about what a proficiency scale is, and how we would use them in linking our priority standards to the assessments that we develop. So steps 1 and 2 for you guys could take, depending on where you are with your department, the whole year. You'll see it says by January ? Or by June ? It really depends on where you are with your team and what your goals are for the year, and we'll revisit that on the 14th as well. Steps 3 and 4 are about getting that assessment designed in such a way that we can record how students are doing in an efficient way before we then look at the outcomes and meet to discuss what we find. Step 7 and 8, some of you are doing this already and some of you it might not be for a while, but on our MTSS calendar, really what we're looking for is some live data that we can use to determine what do kids need, how can we support kids across all departments. So ideally what we'd see is in September, looking back at our spring assessments from the previous year, in January, February, looking at our mid-year assessments, what are we noticing about deficit areas for students? What are we noticing about the level of proficiency they're able to achieve? In this, develop a brief synthesis of your findings. The goal is in the long run that synthesis will provide information to a team that'll meet on a district day-to-day so that we can look at our systems and say, are we providing the best supports for kids? How can we best help our teachers do what they need to do? This year, I'm not sure how far we'll get in that process, if people will have units they've completed where they can do that type of thinking around it, or if this year most of the focus will be on the standards and the scales. So again, that'll be different for different groups. The ultimate goal being at some point you will be able to say, hey, this is something that we've noticed through our summative assessments. The other piece of this, the micro changes to curriculum and instruction, as you get the summative data, you may need to go back and review your proficiency scale. If you notice students really weren't able to identify this thing, which they need to be able to do before they can explain this thing. So through that summative data, you may be adjusting the progression of learning, adjusting your lessons, adjusting the way you introduce the curriculum or the content to get students where they need to be. So that's really the spirit of step 7, steps 1 through 8, with the idea being it's a cycle. Like you'll have these conversations around what you teach all the time. It's not meant to be we're going to get this done and never do it again or never revisit it. But in the end, you will have kind of these products, this documentation of what proficiency looks like and what standards we're focusing on, and that really will help me from curriculum office perspective be able to be a liaison between you and the community and understand the curriculum needs that you might have in your departments. So I'm going to share with you on the 14th, we can spend a lot of time talking about that and revisiting those ideas. I mocked up a sample of what this might look like for a team. In this case, I chose a world history unit to walk through. I don't want anyone to think this is what it has to look like. So this is not a checklist. This is not what Cotter says it has to be. This is the way my brain organized the information when I was working in isolation. So again, probably the most valuable part of this process are the conversations you will have with your department. So determining, what are the units for our semester? How do we determine which units to teach where? And then how do we determine which standards fit in each unit? And notice for world history, I've pulled out our content standards as well as our literacy standards from the Common Core. So I've got them all listed there. And then since I was working by myself, I could choose the priority standards for each one for my unit on World War I. If I was working with other people collaborating on that, that might have been a much more complex task as we grapple with, what are the most important things kids will need to be able to do or know. So again, this product is a vehicle for those really rich conversations. It's not meant to be the purpose of this task. Moving into, once those things are decided, the proficiency scale. A proficiency scale looks a lot like a rubric. The level 3 here is the standard. So the standards that I put together, I chose 2 standards for proficiency. One is a content and one is a skill. And they just happen to align with each other really well. So even though I have 6 priority standards, I didn't make 6 scales. I felt like, these 2 really go together because one's causes of World War I and the other is series of events, cause and effect. So I put those together in one scale because I feel like I could assess those through one assessment. The 3 is the target. A 4 would be above the target. A 2 is below, and a 1 is even more below. Now, notice it says proficiency scale, aka learning progression. Learning progression, and again, we'll go over all of this on the 14th. A learning progression is the idea that I need to be able to do a 1. I have to be able to identify things before I can explain them. And I need to be able to explain them before I can analyze them. So my learning progresses up the scale. Proficiency scale is simply telling me a 3.0, that's proficient. Anything above or below is not. And I've seen scales that say like 2.0 can do a 3 with some help. And I've seen 1.0 can do a 2 with some help. There are different ways of doing these scales. And we can spend some time digging into the different methods. But the goal is that you know what proficiency is. What are we shooting for? And that's really important because the next step is how do we know? So I have a sample assessment here for what it would look like for students to be proficient. And what's tricky about this assessment is questions 1 through 4, if a kid get all of those right, it would put them at a 2 on the scale because I'm asking them what the causes are in a very basic way. 5 through 8 in the assessment, this is your in-depth explanation. And so really that allows a student to show me that they are proficient. They would be getting a 3 on those questions. Now, potentially they could be getting 4s if their in-depth explanation starts to go into this larger analysis with a global context. And then number 9, this is a short answer question that really allows students to explore this beyond proficiency. So what I could see is if a student gets these right, I'm comfortable that they're at a 2. If a student gets these right, I'm comfortable that they're at a 3. And if they really knock this out of the park, I'm comfortable they're at a 4. This is a proficiency-based assessment. I'm looking for, can they demonstrate proficiency? It's rubric style as far as the bubble sheet. Notice down here I've got this word about grading. If a student gets a 3, if I determine through this assessment they're a 3, well, a 3 out of 4 is 75%. I'm not saying that they have a C, I'm saying they're proficient. So we have to be careful in designing these assessments that we don't equate proficient with a percentage. At some point as a department we will have to grapple with how do we translate this into the grade book, but that's a separate conversation that we will need to address down the road. Then we address our lessons and activities. Once the assessment has been given at the end of the activities, it'll be put into Elluminate Ed and we can run some reports. Now this is an awful picture, I will get you a better copy, but from some of my assessments from teaching 2 years ago, this is a list of reports I got from an AP comparative government test, and it's response frequency, teacher overview. It lets me see how the students did on the assessment, and since it's a proficiency based assessment, that lets me see what areas were they strong in and what did they struggle with. So as a department we could do that. We could pull that, look at our summative assessment, and then discuss, using protocols, what is it we want to revisit? Might we want to adjust our proficiency scale? Did we get to the level of rigor that we wanted? And then make any small changes to either our instruction, our curriculum, or our assessment that we feel like is necessary. So this is meant to be a cycle. It's meant to be something that we commit to doing during our content time as the flow fits. So if we get to one step in the cycle and that's where we stay, that's what we'll work on. So I wanted you to have time to look at that. I've attached both the documents to this email prior to us meeting on the 14th. We will really dig into it on the 14th and start figuring out, how do we want to do this work and what supports do we need. So feel free to email me prior to our teacher leader time if you need more clarification, or bring some standards with you or bring a unit with you and we can start talking about how we want to do this work and how I can support you as a department chair. Otherwise, just let it kind of soak in, and we'll talk about this more when I see you on the 14th. So thanks for listening. That was 13 long minutes. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.